All right. Hello, everyone. This is going to be our lecture on evolution by natural selection. Hope you're all ready to go. So let's go ahead and get started. Hope you have your handout with you so you can write stuff down. Let's go. All right. So we have to start off first by this talking about this idea of theory, um, because this is a word that people get confused with or they kind of mess up or whatever. A theory, well, I should say, a scientific theory is a different thing than than what the word means in general conversation. So, um, when you watch a police show on TV, there's been a robbery and the police have a theory about who their suspect might be. It means they have a hunch or an idea of who the bad guy was, who did the robbery, right? That kind of theory in sort of general conversation is very different from a scientific theory. A scientific theory is an explanation um, of some kind of natural phenomena that we can observe, and the scientific theory is supported by lots and lots of evidence gathered over a long period of time by lots of different investigators, um, all supporting this explanation of whatever the phenomena is. When you have an explanation that's supported by lots and lots of data from lots of different people over a long period of time, you can call it a scientific theory. So that's a very different thing than what we have in kind of general conversation. A scientific theory is not a hunch or an idea. All right, just want to make that clear. Okay, so why is it not moving? There we go. So we can define evolution as a gradual change in a species or in a population through adaptations over time. And that's basically what evolution means. Um, we have lots of evidence that evolution exists. In fact, nobody really doubts that organisms change over time, over millions of years. The fossil record and our own observations tell us that evolution happens. But we didn't always really understand how it worked. We didn't have a mechanism to understand how evolution happened. That's what Darwin did. He didn't really like discover evolution. He's not the father of evolution. What he did do is come up with an explanation for how it happened. He said evolution happened by natural selection. All right, so he proposed that a new species could develop, that's what evolution is, by the process of natural selection. What does that mean? Well, natural selection means a better adapted organism will survive and produce more offspring than a less well adapted organism. All right, so that's what natural selection means. And Darwin came up with this idea through his observations. We'll talk more about that in a sec. Um, and this was his explanation for how evolution happened. All right. So anyway, when something that's better adapted to its environment survives and produces more offspring, that's uh, natural selection. All right. And the result of this is to increase the proportion of that better adapted organism in its population. Now, think back to the allele frequency lab we did a couple of days ago with the giraffes and the black and white beans, right? Um, if you remember the setup, the short-necked giraffes were not able to get food because of a drought, which represents our naturals, our evolutionary pressure. Um, the short-necked giraffes couldn't get food, so they died off before they could reproduce. And we would take those two white beans out of our gene pool, if you remember the lab we did. And the result of that over time is when you looked in your gene pool cup, you would see more and more proportion of black beans representing the longer necked allele and fewer of the white beans. So that happens, that example is what we're talking about here. The better adapted individuals in that case of the lab, the long-necked giraffes or the medium-necked giraffes, were better adapted to get food during that drought, and so they could survive and make offspring, um, and the short-necked giraffes gradually died off. All right, so you may or may not be familiar with Darwin. He gets talked about a lot. He did studied animals in the Galapagos Islands, and found that they had lots of variation and that organisms in this sort of confined um, space, these islands, um, were there was a lot of diversity of organisms, but each organism or type of organism was really well suited to its own environment. So he's probably most popular. He may be most familiar with the Darwin's finches, right? The birds that he studied. He also actually studied the giant turtles that you find on the Galapagos Islands. But let's take a quick look at these birds these finches that Darwin studied. And he looked at the physiology, the anatomy, I guess, the anatomy of birds, for example, their beak shape, um, and noted how well each beak was suited to the kind of food that the bird ate. So, for example, we have fruit eaters, and we have insect eaters, we have cactus eaters, and we have seed eaters. Those are the kinds of food sources that a finch can eat on the Galapagos. And the color coding here kind of connects that. But this guy right here, you notice his beak, he's a fruit eater. So this is a beak that's well suited to eating fruit. And contrast that with this guy over here with this like big, bulky beak. He is a seed eater. We can tell from the color coding up here. He's purple, so he's a seed eater. The seed eater's beak is big and strong and can crush seeds to eat them. This guy over here couldn't survive eating seeds because his beak couldn't break them open. He couldn't get anything out of them. So that's the kind of differences that we're talking about with these Galapagos Island organisms and how well suited they are to their diets. So anyway, that's an example of the variation you see in organisms and how well suited they are to their environments. Lots of other examples here, obviously, but I just wanted to point out the difference between the seed eater and the fruit eater. So that's the kind of observation that Darwin was making in the Galapagos, and that's what he used to formulate his explanation of how evolution happened by natural selection. All right, so natural selection is a mechanism, it's a process for how evolution happens, for how populations change. Okay, and natural selection is responsible for evolutionary change because the natural variation in a species, right, like the giraffes that we looked at in our allele frequency lab, that natural variation allows some organisms to survive and produce offspring better than other organisms of the same species. All right, so that's what we mean when we say this selectively changing genetic variation. That's allele frequency, like we saw with our giraffes the other day, through differentiated survival and reproduction. Okay, that's kind of a more complicated way of saying um, organisms that are well suited to their environment survive and make babies. Organisms that are not well suited to their environment die off and don't get to make babies. And that's how natural selection works. The goal of natural selection, if you want to think of it that way, is for an organism to be fit enough, well enough adapted to its environment so that it can survive and reproduce. That's all. It doesn't guarantee long life or anything like that. Just be fit enough to survive long enough to make babies. All right. And what natural selection doesn't do is give an organism what it needs. All right. It's um, random changes, random variation in a population will give some organisms in that population traits that let them survive better than other organisms. So this guy doesn't have a buzz saw or a chainsaw for a hand. All right. So he's not going to survive as well as this guy is. That's what we're talking about. So how? How does natural selection produce change in a population? Well, we're going to look at 3 different types of natural selection to learn about that. All right. Okay. So, like I said, there'll be 3 different types. We're going to use this diagram here each time. So I want to walk through this diagram a little bit first before we talk about stabilizing selection. So in each of the diagrams, we have this dotted line. And then we start there. That's our original population. And in this graph, we have an x-axis, which is below the edge of the graph here, sorry, below the edge of the image, which shows variation in the population. So if we think back to our giraffe, I'm going to use the giraffe example a lot, giraffe and neck length. So if we think of our giraffes with different neck lengths, we could have that on the x-axis as the sort of natural variation in a population, with some giraffes having really short necks and some giraffes having really long necks, but most giraffes have kind of a medium length neck. All right, so our x-axis is neck length. Our y-axis is the population size. So like I said, most giraffes have a medium shaped neck. Not so many have a really short neck. Not so many have a really long neck. So this is kind of a bell-shaped curve of the population of neck lengths in giraffes. All right, and then we have in this graph, we have some kind of selection, right? Some kind of evolutionary pressure like our drought that we talked about in the allele frequency lab the other day, okay? So some kind of pressure is put on our population and our population changes, and that's what the kind of solid line and the blue curve is about. So this area here, this is what happened to our population after, 100 generations under a strong selection pressure like our lab the other day. All right, so that's the setup for these graphs. You're going to see this graph a couple more times. You have your starting population, and then a pressure is put on that population, and then you have your new population distribution here. All right, so the first of the three types that we're going to talk about is called stabilizing selection. It favors or prefers the average individuals. All right, so and selects against the two extremes. So if we think about our giraffes and our neck length issue, we have some giraffes with really long necks, some with really short ones, and then some with average length necks. Stabilizing selection would favor those medium length necks. So the example I'm trying to think of is, that's kind of a weird one, so stick with me. Um, uh, Imagine there's this population of giraffes living on a savanna somewhere, and there's some kind of disease that knocks out part of the tree population that giraffes eat. And so there used to be, multiple different tree populations, tree species that the giraffes could eat, but some of them die off because of a disease, but one remains. And this one tree population that the giraffes can eat is not very tall. It's kind of a medium height tree. And so it's very easy for medium length necked giraffes to reach the leaves on this tree and chop them down. If you're a short-necked giraffe, you can't reach high enough to get to the leaves of this remaining tree. All right, and this is a stretch, but stay with me. If you're a really long-necked giraffe, when you try to bend your neck over to chomp the leaves on this not so tall tree, you fall over and you die and you can't reproduce. Okay, so I made that up, but whatever, right? So, so really tall-necked giraffes are not well suited to eating this kind of tree, and really short-necked giraffes are not well suited to eating this kind of tree. Only the medium ones are. In that situation, over time, the average neck length giraffe is going to survive and thrive, whereas the long necks and the short necks will die off. All right, this reduces variation of population, but this would be an example of stabilizing selection. Okay. The second kind that we want to talk about is called directional selection. Again, we have that same graph here. So here's our starting population, and then there's some kind of selection pressure put on it, and our population changes. So it's the same graph basically that we were just looking at, with neck length down here in my made-up example, and population size here. All right, so this time directional selection favors one extreme. Now, I think this one's easier to understand than the previous one, and it fits really nicely with that allele frequency lab that we did a couple days ago. So when we did our allele frequency lab, we said there was a drought and only the really tall trees were surviving. The short trees, there was no food available to short-necked giraffes because they couldn't reach the high-up leaves that were available to eat, and so all the short-necked giraffes died off. That's exactly what we're looking at here. We start off with a population that's this kind of average neck length, but there's a selection pressure against the short-necked giraffes because they can't reach food. They die off, but medium neck length and long neck length giraffes do really well, and they survive, and they have lots of babies, and eventually, over lots and lots of time, the population's average neck length will get longer and longer. So that's an example of directional selection. It favors one extreme of the population, in this case the long-necked giraffe. This can produce rapid evolution of a population. The third and final type of selection we're going to talk about is called disruptive selection. And it favors either extreme of a population, but not the middle. So here again, here's our original population, the dotted line. We put some kind of selective pressure again, but this time it selects against the average giraffe in my example. And so this one's also a little hard to imagine, but stick with me. So maybe in this savanna, there are 3 different food sources for giraffes. There's some really tall trees, there's some medium trees, and then there's some shrubbery, really short shrubs that can be eaten, and giraffes can survive on any of those. But then there's some kind of you know, change in the environment, and that medium height tree um, is killed off by a bug of some kind, a virus, whatever. Something happens to that one food source that the medium neck length giraffe can eat. And so the tall giraffes are fine because they can still eat the tall trees, and the short giraffes are fine because they can eat the shrubbery, but the medium neck giraffe is bummed because his food source is gone and he dies off. Um, and so that would be an example of disruptive selection. So there's something that selects against the average neck length giraffe and favors the 2 extremes that we have here. This is the type of selection that can produce 2 new species, because if this situation holds for many generations, eventually you'll get 2 different populations of giraffes that eventually won't be able to interbreed with each other anymore, and you get 2 new species. All right, but that only works for disruptive selection. This is the one that can produce new species. So here's another vocab word for you, speciation. That's the process of producing 2 species from one. And that's what we're trying to diagram here. So we have one bird species here. There's some kind of selective pressure put on the bird, and some birds survive and produce a different species, and the original bird also survives. And now we have 2 bird species where there used to be 1. And this kind of answers the question somebody asked me the other day about how is it that if humans evolved from earlier apes or monkeys or whatever, why are monkeys still around? Well, the same reason that this bird is still around. The selective pressure to produce this part of this type of bird didn't select against this one. It just provided an advantage to this guy. So what happens is eventually over time, we produce an environment where this type of bird survives, but this previous type of bird also still survives in its environment. All right, so it doesn't mean that all of these birds transformed into something else. Instead, 2 different populations form, and eventually 2 different species form. The old one's still around, and now you've got a new one too. Okay, that's what speciation is. Okay, now we have to talk about lines of evidence for evolution. And so there are, I think, 6 of them. So here we go. Let's walk through them. The first line of evidence for evolution by natural selection are called structural adaptations. These are similarities that you can see in different organisms in the way their bodies are put together. For example, there are many, but one example is the methods of protection, so things like teeth and claws and thorns. Teeth in different organisms are similar, and the more similar they are, the more closely related the 2 organisms are, and the less similar they are, the more distantly related they are. So you can use structural adaptations to kind of put organisms into relatedness connections to see who's related to whom. So that works for things like teeth and claw. Also mimicry and camouflage. Mimicry means making yourself look like another organism, like a non-poisonous snake that mimics the appearance of a poisonous snake, or camouflage, where an organism looks like its surroundings or its environment. So this diagram here, this picture here, is not a dead leaf like you might think at first. It's actually a frog. It's a frog that has evolved to look like its environment. So it lives in forests where there are leaves fall to the ground, and it can camouflage or hide in those leaves because it looks like them. And the way organisms camouflage themselves or develop camouflage is another way to connect organisms in an evolutionary tree. Second line of evidence for evolution by natural selection are physiological adaptations. So by this, I mean changes in the way the organism's metabolism works, like the way it breaks down its sugars or produces its energy. the example we have here is resistance to antibiotics. So probably you've heard of MRSA or MRSA as a drug-resistant bacteria. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacteria that's pretty common, and we have had a lot medications, antibiotics to treat Staph aureus infections for a long time. But since is a natural variation in the bacterial population, some bacteria are resistant to the antibiotics, and those survive the antibiotics and develop resistance to it. So they have some bacteria change their metabolic processes to be resistant to the drugs that we kill them off with, and that's where we get antibiotic resistant bacteria, which is kind of a problem. And MRSA is an example of an antibiotic resistant bacteria. So that's an example of how physiological adaptations are supporting the idea of evolution by natural selection. Of course, one of the most well-known lines of evidence supporting evolution by natural selection are fossils. They provide a record of early life and of changes that organisms have gone through over time. So here are three different skulls of related organisms: the Pachycetus, the Etiocetus, and the beluga whale. They're connected to each other. They're evolutionarily related to each other. And we've noticed, or you can see, that as they evolved over time into different organisms, the nostrils in the front of the skull in the Pachycetus gradually migrated to the middle of the skull and then to the top of the skull by the time you get to the beluga whale today. And so when you compare these organisms, you can put them kind of in sequence, who came first and second and third, based on partly upon this kind of change in the fossil. So the fossil record provides a really powerful and strong line of evidence supporting evolution by natural selection. So, okay. Oh yeah, that piece. Okay, so the fourth line of evidence for evolution by natural selection is anatomy, or the way a body is put together. So we have three kind of important vocab terms here that I want you to become comfortable with. The first vocab term is called homologous structures. So these are structural features that have a common evolutionary origin. What does that mean? Okay, well, structural feature, that means a body part. All right, so in my example here, we're going to talk about something called a forelimb, which means a front leg or an arm. Okay, so back long ago, millions of years ago, there was an organism that developed 4 legs, 2 front legs and 2 back legs, and the front legs are called forelimbs and the back legs are called hind limbs. All right, and so there was an organism that developed a 4-limb structure, 4 different limbs, front legs and back legs. That organism eventually diverged into a number of different organisms that have 4 legs or 4 limbs, including humans and birds and porpoises and elephants. That front leg, or the forelimb, serves different purposes now. So in the elephant, the front leg is still a leg, but in a porpoise, that front leg has turned itself into a fin. And in a bird, that front leg has turned itself into a wing. And in the human, of course, it's an arm. So what we have is 4 different structures, all that used to be a forelimb. They derive from the same evolutionary ancestor, but they serve different purposes today. So those are called homologous structures. The arm, the wing, the flipper or the fin, and the leg. Those are homologous structures. Okay? Now contrast that with an analogous structure. Okay? An analogous structure is a body part of an organism that solves a given problem different ways. That's the way I like to think about it. So let's say, for example, we're talking about the problem of how can you fly, the problem of flight. Well, it's been solved. That problem has been solved a couple different ways. Some organisms developed wings like birds did. Their forelimb turned itself into a wing. That's how the bird solved the problem of flight. Insects like flies and bees also solved the problem of how to fly, but they didn't have a forelimb that turned into a wing. They developed a wing completely differently. Right? You end up with the same solution. You can fly, but the bird does it with a modified forelimb. The bee does it with a completely different structure. It's not a forelimb at all. So the bird wing and the bee wing, or the fly wing, are analogous structures. They do the same, they solve the same problem, but they did it with no sort of evolutionary connection. All right. The third vocab term on this slide is a vestigial structure. And that's something, some kind of function or some body part that doesn't have a function today but did in the past, like the human tailbone. We don't have tails, so we don't need a tailbone, but we still have it. It's a vestigial structure. It's left over. That's what vestigial structures are. They're leftover body parts. All right. So these different types of anatomy can also be used to connect organisms evolutionarily and understand how organisms evolved over time. The fifth way of taking a look at natural or evolution by natural selection is embryology. In other words, the way organisms develop when they're embryos. There are lots of similarities among young embryos in different species, and these suggest that these species had a common ancestor. So fish embryo, reptile embryo, bird embryo, human embryo, they all look very much alike. They have a lot of similarities in their embryology, and that suggests that they came from a common ancestor. And of course, the sort of newest line of evidence to support evolution by natural selection would be methods to compare DNA sequences between two organisms. So if you look at human DNA and chimpanzee DNA, and you compare them, literally line them up, they're 99% identical. Humans and chimpanzees evolved or diverged from each other pretty recently. If you compare human DNA and, I don't know, chicken DNA, there are a lot more differences because humans and chickens diverged a long time ago. All right, so that's how you can use, nucleic acid or DNA and RNA information to compare organisms and see how long ago they diverged from one another. All right, so the next topic that we need to touch on is how do we know when things happened? I'm not sure I really phrased this the best way right here. How do we know what happened when? How do we know how long ago something happened? Well, there are three ways. One is called radiometric dating. You might be familiar with this as carbon dating or carbon-14 dating. This is a strategy for looking at the amount of radioactive elements in an organism or in a fossil and comparing them to determine how long ago an organism died or lived, I suppose. So you can use radioactive decay of different elements to make directly date things, carbon dating. Another strategy to determine how long ago something, or to date something, I suppose, would be stratigraphy. So if you've ever looked at a cliff, or if you go to the Grand Canyon, for example, you look at the cliff walls, you can see strata or layers. Strata means layers. Okay, you can see the layers in a cliff, in a geological formation. Those strata can help you determine what sequence of events and relative dates. So, for example, so if you look at the strata, like you went to the Grand Canyon or looked at the side of a canyon wall, you would see these layers. The lower down layers are older, and the higher up layers are newer, right? So if you found a fossil, for example, right here in this orange section, you would know that it is older than a fossil that you found up here in this brown section. So you can look at strata or layers in geological formations and come up with a sequence of events to help extrapolate dates, figure out when things happened. The third way we can date events is called a molecular clock, and that's not really a clock like you see on the wall that ticks with hands and so on. A molecular clock is really a protein. And you can compare the proteins from different organisms to see how much they've changed, how different they are, and from that you can get an estimate for how long ago the organisms diverged. So for example, there's a protein called hemoglobin that carries oxygen in your blood. And you can look at human hemoglobin and compare it to, lamprey hemoglobin. A lamprey is an aquatic organism that diverged from humans a long time ago. The number of differences between human hemoglobin and lamprey hemoglobin the number of differences between them give you an indication of how long ago those organisms diverged. That's what we're trying to say here. So that comparing protein sequences is called a molecular clock. Okay, so last slide, sort of a wrap-up slide. All of this stuff is important, of course, but you can think about it in these four ways. So variation, that's like the natural differences that occur between individuals of a given species. Some humans are tall, some humans are short, some humans have brown hair, some humans have red hair. That's the natural variation in a species. Um, that natural variation, of course, is passed on to your offspring. Um, and then and so that's what inheritance is. Selection is an environment that provides a benefit to some variants, but not to others, to long-necked giraffes, but not to short-necked giraffes. All right, so that's selection. And then, of course, the last one is time. One of the hardest things to understand about evolution and to kind of wrap your mind around is how long this takes. Okay, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years or longer, millions of years. Big, big, big time frames where small random changes may have a big effect over long periods of time. So those are sort of the four kind of high-level notes that you could take away from this. All right, so that's our evolution by natural selection notes. I hope that you had as much fun as I did.